In this video, we're going to be covering some of the more advanced parts of baking in PBR Painter. If you haven't yet watched the basic tutorial, I definitely recommend watching that first because this one follows on directly from that previous video. So in that last video, we went through the basics of baking and we created this example material that we then baked into image textures. Now we're going to look at some of those more advanced things that you can do with baking. So the first thing I'm going to look at is underneath the bake settings. As I mentioned in the last video, we can set up a custom file name. So from that last video, we saw that when we baked our images, they came out with this file naming convention, which was basically the mesh that we're working with, the channel name, and then the optional resolution at the end. So if you want to use a custom convention, we can tick this box, and in this box in here, we can set up a specific configuration. And just like the baking settings up here, we can save and load these configurations directly. So the way that this works is that we add these name parts and then we get our final file name. So I'm just going to start by adding parts to make it obvious what's actually happening. So I'm going to add the object name, which is following the same convention as the standard PBR Painter because it just adds the object name as the start of the file name. Then I'm going to add the channel name, or I can add the material name if I want to. So now it's actually joined the object name with the material name. Then I can add the channel name, for example. Basically, you can add all these different parts together, and that's going to dictate how each individual channel is going to be baked. So if we leave it like that, it's going to bake the base color like this, and it's going to bake all the other channels with the same kind of convention, but instead of saying base color, it's going to say roughness or normal or whatever that is. Other than just adding these different parts in this way, there's a couple of other things you can change. So you can change the delimiter here, which is basically the separation between these different parts. So by default, it's an underscore, but you can make it one space, you can make it multiple spaces, you can make it anything you want. And it will basically separate out your different parts with this character in here. You can also make it all lowercase if you want to. And the other cool thing you can do is underneath the add part, you can add a custom, which is basically anything you want. So this will just be a constant word that you just put in, and it will just put this wherever you place it within your parts in here. But you can also add a replace, and this is basically going to act as a function which is going to change this existing name, and it's going to take some from text and replace it with some other text. So for example, if you don't like base color as the name for this channel, you can put base color here and change it to albedo maybe, or color, whatever it is that you need for your specific convention. So this then essentially gives you that full flexibility to export your images in whatever format is necessary or whatever naming convention is necessary for your specific application. The next thing I'm going to look at is underneath exporting. In the last video, underneath manual selection of channels, I mentioned this idea of channel packing. So what this is it's basically a way of taking these baked images for these different channels, so color, roughness, metallic, and packing them into the image channels, so for example the red, green or blue channels, so that when you're baking these into your images, you're compressing them into fewer images. So for example, we can have an image that has the red is the roughness, the green is the metallic, and the blue is the ambient occlusion, as an example. And you can set that up in PBR Painter using this interface in here. So what you need to do is need to turn on channel packing. You can save and load configurations as per the other parts of the baking. But the way you set this up for baking is you add one or more channel packed images. And these are not real images, these are just configurations to tell PBR Painter how to bake each of these different channels. So for example, if we add the first one and we make the color the base color, maybe the alpha could be the ambient occlusion of that mesh. And so these little letters here tell us which channels we're using. So we're using color and alpha. The other thing you can do is you can pack individual RGB channels. So I'm going to make another image in here. And for this one, I'm going to pack those channels, and I'm going to call this one metal rough. And this one's going to be called color ambient or color AO. And for this one, I'm going to pack the individual channels, and I'm going to put the red is going to be the metallic, the green is going to be the roughness. And then finally, I'm going to make another one, and I'm just going to make this one the normal. And in this case, I'm going to make the color just that normal channel. So once you've set up this configuration, now when you hit bake, instead of selecting the channels using the automatic method that we did in the last video, which basically just baked one at a time and just saved one channel per image, it's now going to look at these and it's going to bake what it needs to create these channel packed images. So now when I click bake, click OK, it's going to do the same baking process, so it has to bake the same images. So now it's actually baking the ambient occlusion. Now it's baking the roughness and the metallic together, which is why it's this color image. And then finally just the normals. So now that that's finished, we can have a look at what it actually baked. So the metal and rough, as we said, is now this red and green image that looks like this. The other thing that's great about channel packing is that it also works with merge. I'm going to do the same thing. I might drop the resolution just to make it bake a bit faster, but I'm going to do the same thing now and I'm going to merge this using this channel packing setup. Okay, so that's now baked. If we have a look at the layers, it looks like it's worked correctly, so this all looks the way that it did. And we can actually check that because this is the backup material that it made, so that's actually correctly baked. And if we have a look into the different channels, it's now added the images in here. But what's great is that it's actually added an ambient occlusion texture now, and this has gone into this use AO texture color correction, and it's using the alpha channel because that's what we set up for this particular image. And in the same way, if we look at the metal, it's now using this metal image and it's using the red channel. So it's correctly assigned the red channel to this image, and it's now just using that red channel for the metallic. And in the same way, it's just using the green channel for the roughness. So this is another way that you can bake fewer images and get the same amount of information and then share these images across channels. Okay, so the final thing I'll go through in this video is baking mesh maps. Mesh maps are essentially images that describe different properties of the mesh. So for example, we can have a position map, which basically just shows the position of each part of the mesh. The normal, which again is just the normals from that mesh, and all these other things that describe different maps to do with the geometry of that mesh. What we can do is we can actually bake any number of these out in advance into images, and these can be used in different parts of the add-on so that we're not having to basically generate these maps using nodes. So this can speed things up, and it can also mean that you can use certain types of masks in Eevee that you otherwise would need to use in cycles. So for example, this pointiness map, we can't see anything in Eevee, but if we go to cycles, we can now see that this actually shows information about the edges on our mesh. And the same thing goes for this bevel and also for ambient occlusion. At the moment, the main area where these mesh maps are used are within masks. So I'm going to show exactly how that works using the ambient occlusion as an example. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bake this, and you can bake one or more by just selecting these different bake buttons here. And it will do the same thing as the other baking where it will just bake one at a time until it's finished. But for the sake of this, I'm just going to bake the one. And I'm just going to do a 2K resolution and then put the samples up for baking the ambient occlusion to something like 16. And I'll speed this up for the video. And now that that is baked, it is now appearing as an image in here. And so what we're now previewing is not the ambient occlusion node, it's actually that image. So we can go out of cycles into Eevee. So even if you don't have ambient occlusion turned on in Eevee, you can then still see this because it's now baked into this image. So if we now use a mask on one of our layers, so I'm just going to turn this preview off. If we take this layer and add a mask that uses ambient occlusion, so for example, this grunge mask, click OK. There's this option with all the masks to basically use a baked mesh map whenever possible. So if this is turned on, as you can see here, it's found that mesh map, the AO mesh map, and it's now using that to generate the ambient occlusion rather than doing it through a node. So if you turn that off, it's now using a node, and you can see that it then disappeared. So if we have a look at the mask, when we put this on, it's now using that baked map to generate this grunge mask. And this is an alternative way to use masks in Eevee that would otherwise be better in cycles. So one way is to actually just bake the mask in cycles, but using a mesh map means that we can then access all of these normal properties of the mask, but bypass the need for that ambient occlusion or the need for the pointiness or whatever that map is that we want to render in cycles. Also, if you've got a bunch of masks already that are using ambient occlusion and they have this option ticked, and then you go in and bake the ambient occlusion later, it will automatically update to all of your existing masks to make sure that they're updated to actually utilize that map. So that's really handy as well because you don't have to go back through and turn them all on manually. Okay, so that's one of the main uses of mesh maps, and I'm going to turn that one off for now, and I might just get rid of that mask. Same thing goes for all these other maps. So when they're used in masks and you have that option turned on, it will use these instead of using nodes that generate those based on the model. And this is a really useful way to reduce computation and get more out of your masks by pre-baking your necessary mesh maps at the beginning. Okay, so that's all the topics that I wanted to cover for this video. As always, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in another video. Cheers.